to ThinkCast. I'm Casey Panetta. Today on the podcast, I'm talking with Brian Burke, Research Vice President with Gartner, about one of my favorite pieces of research, the Gartner Hype Cycle for Emerging Technologies. If you're not familiar with the history of the Hype Cycle and want to know more about them, go ahead and pause this podcast and start with our recent behind-the-scenes episode all about hype cycles and how they came to be. Today, we'll be talking about the different technologies featured on the Hype Cycle, how they were selected, and the big themes that are driving this year's research. Hi, Brian. Welcome back to ThinkCast.
Hi, Casey. Thank you.
Really excited to have you here today. As you know, this is one of my favorite research pieces to talk about. But for those of us who aren't maybe as familiar with this particular hype cycle, this is the original hype cycle, right?
That's correct. This hype cycle has been around since 1995, originally published by Jackie Fenn. And so, yes, we've expanded to many hype cycles, but this was the original. But now we publish about 100 hype cycles every year.
So I do want to say we have a great podcast with Jackie Fenn about the origin of the hype cycle. If you guys want to go back and listen to it, it's really great. But to talk more about emerging technologies specifically, how many technologies are featured on this year's hype cycle?
This year, we're featuring a few less technologies than last year, about 25.
I know you don't obviously start with the 25 originally picked out. So how many did you guys start with this year? And what was the process for getting a technology featured?
What we do is we look across all of the technologies on all of the different hype cycles. That's about 1,500 technologies. And that's where we start. We start by going through and selecting by criteria. So we're looking for technologies that are either embryonic or emerging. And we're looking for technologies that are going to have a transformational impact on organizations. And so that gets us down to a couple of hundred different technologies. And then from there, we go through a process of manually eliminating technologies that have been on the hype cycle for emerging technologies previously, are specific to an industry, and so on and so forth. We get down to about 60, and then we go through a voting process with a group of people that are chiefs of research for IT leaders. And those 14, 15 people, they cast their vote on the 60 innovation profiles. And we take the top 25, and that's how we get to the hype cycle for emerging technologies.
I know you mentioned getting rid of things that had been featured previously. And for people who haven't seen this full research, there is actually a list of things that are moving off the hype cycle this year. But was there any technology that you were surprised to see move off?
I guess there's one that's kind of interesting by its absence, is health passports. It could be implemented in various forms, often in a QR code that indicates that either you've been vaccinated, you've been recently tested, you can demonstrate that you've had the disease. And so that allows you to travel, and depending on where the jurisdiction is, allows you into restaurants and shopping centers and everything else. Now, the reason that it's surprising that it was on last year and not on this year is because lots of people are talking about health passports. I just got mine yesterday from the government in Andorra, where I live. But I know that there's a great debate in the United States and in Canada, in Germany, and other countries about whether this is invasive for privacy or do the health benefits outweigh those risks. And so I guess it's a little surprising that it's not on this year because it is all over the press this year. But we had it highlighted last year, but not this year.
So this year's hype cycle has 3 themes. Can you talk a little bit about what each one is and how those came to be?
The first theme is engineering trust. And really what engineering trust is about is ensuring that we have trust for security of data between our transactions, ensuring that people that we're transacting with or entities are those that we think they are. And it's really the foundation for exchanging information. So engineering trust is one theme. Accelerating growth is another theme. And so once we have trust in place, then we need to focus on growth. And so these are the technologies that are focused on accelerating growth. And finally, sculpting change. Sculpting change is really about how do we avoid the chaos in change and really bring order to change. And so those are 3 themes this year.
I want to pause quickly to invite our listeners to learn more about the Emerging Technologies Hype Cycle via the article available in the show notes and also at Gartner.com. So again, for those who haven't seen the actual research, each of the technologies is sorted into one of these themes. So I want to talk first about the first one, which you said engineering trust. Can you share an example technology and why it fits under that theme?
Well, there's, many technologies in the theme of engineering trust. One technology we could talk about is non-fungible tokens. And there's another technology that is getting a lot of press this year. It's only been around for a few years, but really taken off this year. What non-fungible tokens are, or people may even know them better as NFTs, they're a blockchain-based digital token that's linked to an asset, most often in the digital world, but could potentially be in the physical world. And those assets typically are going to be media content most often, I would say. So things like digital art, digital music, and anything else really, where we have a unique asset, as I say, most often in the digital world. And what non-fungible tokens do is it provides for, think of it as a licensing scheme for those creative works. And so that's one of the technologies that's in that area of engineering trust.
We could probably do an entire podcast on NFTs alone.
Absolutely.
But for the second trend, which is accelerating growth, what is one of the technologies under that theme this year?
Under accelerating growth, there's a number of interesting technologies, but I think I would want to talk about digital humans. And digital humans are a digital representation of a person. Now, that person could be a real person, or it could be digitally generated person. So think of a video of a person, either real or fake, giving a speech or doing training or, performing. And so these digital humans, that's kind of where they are now. So just to give you an example, if the CEO of our company wanted to deliver a message in, Spanish and German and Norwegian, but only spoke English, you could do that with a digital human. What would happen would be there'd be a capture process to capture the image, and then by using his voice and overlaying that with different languages, you can create a video that would have him delivering a message in those different languages. And so that's kind of where the technology is today. But where it's going in the future is actually even more interesting, where what we're starting to see is licensed digital personas. And so these personas, either real or fake, can be licensed and they can be then monetized. And so what we're seeing is the emergence of a digital human economy. The other thing that a digital human allows you to do is you and your digital human could be in two different places, or as many digital human copies of you as you want, could be in two places in the virtual world at the same time. And so, they can represent you in that virtual world. So digital humans, we have, interesting technologies right now that are available, but it's interesting where the technology is going in terms of enabling this digital human economy.
Being able to exist in two places at once is an interesting concept. I do want to go back briefly because you were talking about personas. Can you explain a little bit more about what that really means and maybe an example of it?
So a persona is an aggregation of personality traits that represent a segment of the population. That's kind of, where the origin of the term came from. When we talk about a licensed digital persona, what we're talking about is a digital human that is licensed. So these personas are representations of individuals that are licensed.
So for the third theme this year, which is sculpting change, what is a great example of a technology under that theme?
Oh, and one interesting technology under that theme is physics-informed AI. And what physics-informed AI is it applies the rules of physics to AI. So traditionally AI, and if you're talking about machine learning, learns from a number of examples. And that requires a lot of examples for machine learning to really develop and learn a model from examples. But there are no, natural boundaries. So if you only have a small data set, then, your AI model could predict something that is physically impossible. So what physics-informed AI does is it really helps to, first of all, decrease the level of training data that's required and increase the reliability of the predictions that we're making with that model. Because once we have physics-informed AI, then, we aren't going to be predicting things that couldn't be possible in the physical world.
And I know one interesting application that you talked about in the research piece was things like climate change that are just super complex and require a lot of input.
Yeah, that's one example of, one of the kinds of things that we could be focusing on with physics-informed AI, where we have a lot of data, but by applying the laws of physics to the models that we're developing around that, that's certainly going to improve the accuracy and reliability of those predictions.
Before we continue, learn more about the emerging trends shaping IT and business at Gartner IT Symposium Expo. You'll uncover new ways to approach critical challenges, accelerate digital transformation, and become an even more effective leader. For more information, check the show notes or visit Gartner.com. You've given us a few different examples of technologies that are on the hype cycle this year, but I want to ask, what do you think is the most interesting technology profile this year?
They're all interesting. One that, kind of caught my eye is machine-readable legislation. And what machine-readable legislation is where we are developing legislation and code to implement that legislation at the same time, and effectively so that, the legislation aligns with the code and vice versa. I can tell you, when I worked in IT in government for quite a few years, there is tremendous interpretation between what it says in legislation and what actually gets implemented in code. The simple fact is that most of that interpretation is done, by a developer in the IT organization. And so what machine readable legislation does is it really forces the legislators to make the decisions about how that legislation is going to actually be implemented. So legislation, as it's traditionally been developed, is very vague. And what that does is it really forces legislators to make those decisions about how that legislation will really work in the real world.
That is really an interesting one. So I think with this research note in particular, the emerging technologies are so fascinating and so interesting, and your team does a great job of explaining them. But I do wonder, how should organizations, executives, CIOs, how should they be using this piece of research from day to day? Like, what can they really do with it? What should their action items be?
So the way that CIOs and innovation leaders in organizations would use this research is really as input to their future planning. So on the hype cycle for emerging technologies, there are certainly some technologies that are commercially available, but they're all in very early stages, and some still are in the labs. So this is an input into your early planning for your tech radar. And what you want to do is to identify the technologies that you believe are going to be most impactful to your industry and potentially to your organization. And you do that by identifying the technologies and the use cases and determining what would be a potential use within your organization to develop a business scenario or how that might be implemented in your organization. And then once you get to there, you want to determine, how far out into the future do you think it's going to be before this technology is mature enough for deployment? And then what most organizations will do is they'll populate a tech radar with the technologies that they're watching. And then they monitor them over the time until they become mature enough to deploy in that business scenario. So this is really a forward planning tool for understanding what are the technologies that you need to be aware of so that, you don't get caught unaware of the technologies that are going to be impactful to your industry. And you have the advantage of being an early adopter of those technologies as well.
So you did mention setting up a time limit, and I want to ask, so in the research, you actually have for each technology profile sort of an estimate of, 1 to 3 years when this will be an impactful. How do you decide on those?
That's decided by the group of analysts that developed the innovation profile for that technology. And that is our most reasonable guess for when that technology is going to be mature. Thinking about things like, what are the use cases for those technologies? How are they being deployed? What is the, number of organizations that have deployed that successfully? Those kinds of things. Is there any external factors that we need to consider? Things like regulation or social acceptance. And so there's a lot of factors that we would consider when we determine what is going to be the time frame for those technologies. And we take that into account and take our best guess in terms of, what we believe is going to be the time frame for that technology to reach the plateau of productivity.
Well, as I said earlier, this is always such an interesting piece of research. Do you have any final thoughts to share with our audience?
I would mention one thing that, we're looking at the hype cycle for emerging technology for 2021, but the way that the hype cycles work is that we highlight technologies on this hype cycle for emerging technologies, usually only for a year or two. And so I would encourage people to go back is if they're going through this process of identifying what are the technologies that they need to watch, go back a year or two as well. Because there may have been technologies like Health Passport that was on last year, but not on this year, that, have been displaced on the hype cycle that also could be interesting to organizations. I'd also say, look at industry-focused hype cycles, look at any technology areas that you're interested in and the hype cycles that focus on those areas. So if you're interested in artificial intelligence, we have a hype cycle dedicated to artificial intelligence. If you're interested in blockchain, we have a couple of hype cycles dedicated to blockchain. So take a look at not just the hype cycle for emerging technology this year, but look at a couple of years back and take a broader view as well across industry and different areas of technology.
So basically, there's a hype cycle for everyone? Is that what you're saying?
Just about. I think there's just about a hype cycle for everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us, Brian. I appreciate the time.
Okay, thanks, Casey.
For more information on this hype cycle or to learn more about the other hype cycles that Brian mentioned, head over to Gartner.com and search Gartner ThinkCast to see this episode's page, which includes links to some articles on hype cycles. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your colleagues, subscribe, and rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time on Gartner ThinkCast.
Gartner ThinkCast is a production of Gartner, the world's leading research and advisory company, equipping executives across the enterprise with indispensable insights, advice, and tools to achieve their mission-critical priorities. You can learn more at Gartner.com. All content in Gartner ThinkCast is owned by Gartner and cannot be repurposed or reproduced without Gartner's consent. Gartner is an impartial, independent analyst of business and technology. This content should not be construed as a Gartner endorsement of any enterprise's products or services. All content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of those speakers and their organizations.